Shalom and welcome back to our classes for the Introduction to Talmud. And I am Jonah, and this is
And I'm Raysh.
Raysh. And you'll notice that there's something very different about me today, which is that I just shaved. So no beard like I had last time. Very, very smooth. But that is not the important thing that we're talking about today.
Or is it?
It isn't. The important subject that we're talking about today is we are going to move along through the Talmud and through rabbinic literature and all the books of the rabbis, and we're going to see what different subjects did the rabbis talk about in their time. Now, we looked last time at a passage from Masechet Brachot, the tractate about blessings. Brachot are blessings. And that was the very first tractate of the entire Mishnah, the entire book, the entire collection of Jewish law that was first compiled about 1800 years ago. Now, that section of the Mishnah, there's a whole number of tractates in every section of the Mishnah. The Mishnah, we said last time, has 6 volumes. We say Shisha Sedarim. And actually, if you take the beginning of Shisha and you take the beginning of Sedarim, you get Sh and S. And some people talk about the entire Mishnah and they talk about all of rabbinic literature as Shas. Shas, as in the Shisha Sedarim, the 6 volumes of our Mishnah. Now, we've got brachot at the beginning of that first Seder, that first of the Shisha Sedarim, and brachot is not the name of the Seder, though. That's the name of the Masechet. The Masechet is the subcategory, let's say. It's the category inside that tractate, in that volume.
So the volume's the big one, and then the tractates are the small ones inside of each volume.
And you can think of it as in volume or like vast and big, and tractates are teeny, except they're not that teeny. They're actually quite big and long, and
Depending on which one.
Depending on which one, that's true. So the first volume, the first vast volume, the first Seder, is called Seder Zeraim. Zeraim means seeds. And what they mean by seeds is that we're talking about agriculture, and we're talking about the way that nature goes and the way that the land goes and our relationship with land. The funny thing, of course, is that brachot, what do blessings have to do with the land? Well, we talked last time about the sun and the sun rising and the sun setting, and the sun is very connected to agriculture. There's a lot about blessings and a lot about Jewish prayer that in a way is a very earthy or earthly, or it's a very land-based kind of thing. We're going to, when we say a blessing over bread, we say hamotzi lechem min haaretz, who takes the bread out of the land. Now, you don't grow bread out of the land, but our blessed God can make that kind of thing happen. So we are talking about Zeraim, we're talking about seeds, the things that start off tiny, and then they grow and grow and grow and grow and grow and grow and grow, and at the end of Masechet Brachot, at the end of the teeny tractate about blessings, we come to the second tractate of Seder Zeraim, the second book in the Book of Seeds. And this is a tractate that is called Pe'ah.
And one interesting thing concerning Zeraim, seeds, is that traditionally in Jewish biblical culture and also rabbinic culture, there's a real interest in keeping categories pure. What do I mean by that? There's in the Bible, there's the idea of klayim, of mixing two different kinds of seeds together. And it's very important from a rabbinic perspective too, in terms of the mitzvot of keeping things in their exact category. And we'll see that also today. The other major theme we're going to see today that you might think, if we're talking about agriculture and the cycles of harvest, you might think it's really referring mostly to us praying to God for a good harvest and so forth, which is true. But the text that we're going to look at today really foregrounds, really puts at the forefront social relationships, how our own agricultural practices impact each other, and how we can be more conscious of each other's needs when we tend to the land.
Pe'ah is really where we start talking about the agriculture. I mean, you heard me make the whole good argument, let's say it was a good argument, about why brachot is part of this agricultural book, but not so much. We're really talking about blessings, we're talking about prayer, we're talking about not a whole lot of things that has to do with the land, but sometimes. But now we're in Pe'ah, and Pe'ah is all about the laws of how we take our land and use it for good, as Raysh just said. Now, the book of Leviticus, Sefer Vayikra, is where we first hear about Pe'ah. In Pe'ah, or rather in Sefer Vayikra, we hear God command us that we have to leave the Pe'ah of our fields available for those who don't have means, those who don't have money, those who don't have homes, those who are lacking, so that they can glean from the corner of the field. Now, we do have this practice of leaving the corner, and there are different reasons about why is it the corner and why not the middle of the field, and all sorts of different things. But what we're going to look at is how does Pe'ah introduce itself? And unless there's anything you'd like to add, Raysh, I think it might be time to dive in.
Yeah, and you will likely recognize what we're about to study from the daily tefillot. This is something we say at the beginning of prayers every morning, and really helps set up our priorities for the rest of the day. So let's dive into the text.
Okay, and before we dive in, you never dive into a text without saying a bracha, without actually saying a blessing. So we're going to say a blessing, and you can say it with us. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
To occupy ourselves in matters of Torah, which is exactly what we're about to do.
Amen. So, if things go well, there should be a link somewhere in this area on the video, and you should be able to click it. Maybe it's there, maybe it's there. We'll find it and click that link, and that'll give you the link to opening up our page we're looking at. And it says Introduction to Talmud, Mishnah Pe'ah. That's the section of the Mishnah we're studying today. Pe'ah. Now, something that we'll actually talk a little bit more as we go along about some of the structure of this and what makes this very special and makes it unusual for rabbinic texts. But I think, Raysh, would you like to read first, or should I take it?
However you wish.
Raysh, go for it.
All right. Ela devarim she'en lahem shiur. These are the things which have no limit. Hapeah, the crop at the edge. We talked about the field, and there's the corners of the field that you leave for the poor. V'habikurim, and the first fruits. V'ha'ayon ugimilot chasadim, and then you have the sacrificial offerings that the Jews would bring on the 3 festivals of the temple, and Gemilut Chasadim, and the reciprocation of good deeds, the Talmud Torah, and the study of Torah. Elu dvarim she'adam ochel peroteim ba'olam hazeh, ve'akeren kayemet lo le'olam haba. And these next things are, this following list, are the things that if this person eats the fruit of them, it's a entrance point to the next world. Literally, it's like a ray that will bring them into the next world. These things are kibud avaim, respecting one's parents, ugemilut chasadim, again, the reciprocation of good deeds, b'hava'at shalom ben adam l'chavero, so reconciling between 2 friends, bringing peace between 2 friends, v'talmud Torah keneged kulam, and the study of Torah among all. And it is also the greatest. So here we have 2 different categories. We have categories that are unlimited, and there's also overlapping categories within these 2. And then there's ones that are going to give us merit, give us zchut, as we say in Hebrew, for the next world. The question is, what makes one different than the other? In other words, if something is without limit, how is that different than something that brings us into the next world? In other words, what are our top priorities in this world and the next? And maybe the first ones relate mostly to the earthly. If we look at the first one, actually, let's go back to that. We have the bikurim, right, the first fruits. And then we have the rayon, which deals specifically with the temple, which, of course, in the Mishnah context is already in the past. Those are things, and payah, of course. Those are 3 things already that have relevance only in this world, right? So maybe we're thinking of actual versus potential on some level. You know, the second category relates to relations between people, familial relations, the respecting of one's parents, right? Bringing peace between one's friends. These are things that have eternal consequences when we do that, and they require only souls. They don't require material context or material access. It's a very powerful idea, but what's the connecting point between the 2? The 2 they have in common are gemilut chasadim, again, reciprocating kindness, chesed, and Talmud Torah. Those are things that are both material and spiritual. And that is the highest level of bringing both of those together, which will connect this world to the next.
So I'm going to read through that also and talk a little bit about it. I mostly agree with Raysh, but I'm going to point out a few different things to highlight the Mishnah from just one more perspective. Elu dvarim she'en lahem shiur. So these are the matters, these are the things in our lives that don't have an upper limit. As in, you can just keep on giving and giving and giving and giving until you can't give any more. But then even then, she'en lahem shiur, there's no more giving to them. Well, maybe there is a limit, but let's say there isn't. Act as if there isn't a limit.
Next Mishnah will beg to differ.
Ha-pe'ah. So we got the pe'ah, we've got the crop at the edge of the field, which is supposed to be left for the poor to collect. Ve'habikurim. We've got those first fruits of the harvest. Harvest comes and the first olives come into season. The first apples, let's say, the first oranges, all those bikurim, all the things that are the first. You give them over to the priests, and the priests will collect. Ve'harei it is said that the children of Israel had to show up, and literally show up. They had to be seen. Yera'eh. They had to be seen in the temple 3 times a year. And what they brought with them during those moments of Yera'eh, in the moments when they had to be seen, was the sacrifice of the Re'ayon, of the sacrifice that says, here I am, take a look at me. I've got a sacrifice, and this is the sacrifice. That's the proper way to spend this holiday. I was supposed to bring 2 oxen for this holiday. I brought 2 oxen. I was supposed to bring 1 sheep for this holiday. I brought 1 sheep. Whatever I'm supposed to bring, here is my re'ayon. Ugmilut chasadim. So good deeds. Always do good deeds. You can never do too many good deeds. If you did 7 good deeds in one day, I bet you can still do an 8th. If you did 8, you could do 9. You did 9, you could do 10. If you did 100, you can still do 101. There's always one more good deed that you can do every single day. Talmud Torah. Now we're talking. You thought that you could study 1 Torah portion a day? You can study 2 Torah portions a day. Now, what's interesting is that these are all things of you giving to others. That the things that don't have measurement, it's not what people give you that there's no measurement. So when we want more of something, what we should want is we should want to give more, not to take more from others. Of course, there is always a recipient for each of these matters. When you give the crop at the edge of your field, you're giving it to someone who's going to take it. When you give the bikurim, the first fruits, to the priest is going to take it. You give the sacrificial offerings of the 3 festivals. That's Pesach, Passover, Shavuot, the Feast of 7 Weeks, and Sukkot, the Festival of the Tabernacles, when we build little huts for ourselves, the Sukkot. When it comes to that, you know, if you're going to give it to the high priest, the priest's going to take it too. Ugmilut chasadim. You're going to be doing chesed in the world. You're going to be doing acts of loving kindness, and someone's going to be affected by it. V'talmud Torah. That's a question. Is there actually anyone who's receiving Talmud Torah? Maybe you are giving Talmud Torah to yourself and receiving it too when you study Torah, when you learn more. Because does your learning of Torah nourish the soul of anyone else? Does anyone else get healed spiritually by the way that you study Torah? When we take in Torah that helps us help others, then yes. Not always is it so easy to get Torah like that, though. And I think this is why the Mishnah will soon value Talmud Torah above all the rest.
I would argue, though, that Talmud Torah is not a one-directional phenomenon, right? That when we learn Torah, it's a conversation like we're having, and that there's no real such thing as learning or teaching Torah in isolation, right? If you're going to really learn Torah, you're going to be both the teacher and the student at the same time. That's the real Talmud Torah. And that many of these categories, if you think about it in a broader sense, yes, on the surface we are giving, when we give the payah, but really when you're giving, you're buying into a system in which you're also receiving. You're part of a network, a social welfare network that's going to support you. If God forbid you lose your money, then you can be the person, if you know that the payah is going to be there. If your fate changes, you then will be able to benefit from the leftover fruits of the field. Likewise, gimilut chasadim, the word likmol in Hebrew, right, is this idea of being able to reciprocate. So there's a lot of directions happening here. And these lists have to do with a social agreement that I will understand that if I do right by you, you'll do right by me. And this is the essential principle on which these mitzvot really rest.
That's also a good way of looking at it. Moving along. ואלו דברים שאדם אוכל פירותיהן בעולם הזה. These are the things that a person eats, the fruits of them in this world. You eat the fruits of these things. Not literally eating the fruit of these things, but I could talk about the fruit of this family, and I'm talking about the kids of the family, or I talk about I wrote some music and it bore fruit because people listened to it, or because it moved someone, because it moved me even. Things that bear fruit. You eat the fruit that have been born in this world. והקרן קיימת לו לעולם הבא. Now, הקרן קיימת לו לעולם הבא. It's a confusing phrase. Raysh said earlier that it could mean a ray, that a ray shines forth, and that will be your place in the world to come, in heaven, in the Garden of Eden, wherever you think that world to come is, there will be a light that will shine upon your place, and you will be able to be in your proper light, maybe even your spotlight, let's say. Another meaning of the word keren is corner. That a keren comes like a payah that you give. The payah is also a corner. A keren and a payah are both corners. The keren arises for you in the world to come when you eat the fruits in this world. So you eat the fruits here, and then what happened to the fruits? They're gone. No, you'll see them in the next world. There, you get your payah in the next world. So what are the things that happen? Kibud av va'em, honoring your mother, your father. Kibud av va'em, I gotta say, for some people that's really easy, for some people that's really hard, and for most people it's different on different days probably. You know, the rabbis talk about, when do you need to honor your father and your mother? What if your father and your mother are, God forbid, abusive to you, or if they are terrible to you, they're mean to you, they say bad things to you, they hurt you? Do you have to honor them? And the rabbis have, they tend towards the no when it comes to a lot of these answers, when it comes to a lot of these questions, that sometimes kibud av va'em is not all that easy. And the question is, how do you honor them? Do you have to love them? You don't have to love them necessarily, but you have to honor them. Kibud av va'em. How can you eat this fruit in this world when the fruit tastes so bad? Well, in the world to come, you're going to have some fruit that will taste pretty good, because you're going to finally see that keren come. You'll see that payah come. You'll have your own corner to eat from. Gemilut chasadim. Being a nice person is one of the most thankless things you can do in life sometimes. I'm fortunate any day that anyone says thank you to me, and it's not that it's all that rare. I bet that I hear someone say thank you at least once a day. But many people live their lives without ever hearing someone say thank you. You eat the fruits. Someone eats the fruits of the Gemilut Chasadim, and what happens? In the world to come, you'll get that payah, you'll finally get that keren, you'll get your corner, you'll get that recognition, and you will finally find the satisfaction of the hard work that it can be to do good work for others. V'hava'at shalom ben adam lechavero. You see two people yelling at each other, screaming at each other, blaming each other. Each has a different story. You know, these are the things that cause war. And these are the things that make families argue. These are the things that divide friends and friendships and marriages. These are the things that separate children from parents. If you can bring peace, though, between one person and another person, you might not be thanked in the moment, because people who are angry are often hard, and they are very often slow to be thankful and to have gratitude, because they're so full of the fury and the passion of being angry. But if you can bring that peace, you will feel that peace in the world to come. The peace that you gave away will be the peace that you get in the world to come. Talmud Torah keneged kulam. The learning of Torah is just as good as kibud av va'em, honoring your father and your mother, plus gemilut chasadim, acts of loving kindness, plus hava'at shalom ben adam lechavero, plus making peace between two people. Talmud Torah is just as good. And I think that this is a tough question. How could Talmud Torah really be as good as all of these things that are all about how we interact with our friends, with other humans? How is that which is about God just as good as that which helps out the humans? Because, if you study the weekly Torah portion every week, and you have people yelling all around you, will you be any better off having studied the Torah portion? According to this, yes. Do you feel it? It depends on what you feel. Are you letting the Torah overcome you so that you can focus in on the good around you, even when it doesn't seem easy to find the good around you? But maybe the reason that Talmud Torah here is promoted as greater than all of these is because Talmud Torah is such a rare treat. Kibud Av Va'em is so necessary in our daily lives. It's so necessary to get along with our families when we're fortunate enough to have those families. Gemilut Chasadim is so important to fixing this world. Hava'at Shalom ben Adam lechavero, bringing peace between one person and another person, is so important also, because how can you live in a world without peace? V'Talmud Torah, could you live in a world without Torah? A lot of people do. But the people who can live with Torah and bring Torah into the way that they honor their parents, and bring Torah into the way that they treat others with loving kindness, and bring Torah into the way that they bring peace into the world, that is why Talmud Torah is even better, because it can lead to accomplishing all of these matters. Now, two additional things. One is that one thing that makes Talmud study fun is that sometimes we don't know what the rabbis actually thought. We talked last time about how first there was the Mishnah, and then there was the Talmud written several hundred years later. The Mishnah is written around the year 225, about 1800 years ago, and the Talmud is about 1500 years ago. So if I want to read what the Talmud thought of the words that we read last time, when we read Masechet Brachot, then I can pull out the Talmud and read Masechet Brachot. But if I want to read what the Talmud has to say about Pe'ah, guess what I have to do? I have to take a guess. Because Pe'ah, as you might have seen from the very beginning, we're talking a lot about the temple, so much so that the Babylonian Jews, the Jews of Babylonia, in the year 500, must have cared so little about this particular tractate, this teeny tractate, because it had so much to do with the way that we live in the land of Israel. And Babylonia is not in Israel. And they said, we're not going to even bother writing our own commentary on this thing. And if they did ever write their own commentary on this, we don't have it. But not all hope is lost, because the Jews are so lucky that not only do they have one Talmud, but they have two Talmuds. There is the Talmud of Babylonia. It's called Talmud Babli, Babli meaning Babylonian, and there is the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Talmud of Jerusalem. Actually not written in Jerusalem, but near Jerusalem. It was written in the land of Israel. In Israel. So, Talmud Yerushalmi actually has Masachet Peah of its own, and we can study that commentary one day. And let's hope that we'll get there. We're going to probably do some pulling through of the Mishnah, and I think that's going to be our direction for a little bit, but you should write in the YouTube comments whether you'd like us to dive into Talmud itself or keep going through the Mishnah so we can keep getting more and more of a foundational basis for all the different laws and all the different subjects that make Judaism Judaism.
Right. Our thought was to go through every single tractate to give you kind of a taste, at least something from each piece. What's interesting about the difference between the Babylonian Talmud and the Talmud that's called the Talmud Yerushalmi is there are many important stylistic differences. You have a lot more writing in the Talmud Yerushalmi. In other words, less editing. A lot more stuff just thrown onto the page, many more opinions, less punctuation. It's much more difficult to read. So that's why a lot of the classes you'll find online, deal with the Talmud Babli. There's more scholarship, generally speaking, for people like us who are learning. But we'd be happy to also learn the Talmud Yerushalmi because it's very interesting and a lot of times older material. Very interesting to compare similar topics because they overlap quite a bit. But as Jonah just explained, with this particular tractate, the only further discussion we have rabbinically is in the Yerushalmi. So do let us know, and we'll be happy to check it out with you.
Talmud Torah keneged kulam. Talmud Torah is greater than all of these things put together. Well, as good as them. So, given that, we've got a bonus Mishnah for today. We are going to look at Pe'ah 1-2.
And just one last word on the topic of the Yerushalmi and the Babli and kind of the rabbinic angle in writing about this. The Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam piece, that last punchline saying that Talmud Torah is equal and above all these other things is no coincidence because the rabbis are shifting from an agricultural, temple-oriented discussion to prioritizing what they're doing. What is Talmud Torah but what the rabbis are doing? So in a certain way, it's saying what we're doing has the highest value. So it's interesting to think about what each writer's angle is when we're looking at rabbinic sources. So we're going to continue on with Mishnah Pe'ah 1-2. It's also in your sheet from In Pochatin. Jonah, do you want to read it?
Sure. Ein pochatin la pe'ah mishishin. When it comes to dividing up our field and leaving that corner, we never give less than 1/60th of our field to the poor. So, let's say that I was going to give my field just one little corner of my field, and my field was about this big. And I said, all right, how much of this do I want to give? I can give this much. That's too little. I have to be able to give 1/60th or more. I can't give nothing of my field. I have to give at least 1/60th of my field. Hold that thought. 1/60th. Ve'af al pi she'amaru en la pe'ah shiur. Even though before we just said that when it comes to pe'ah, it doesn't have a shiur, it doesn't have a limit. We didn't mean back then we didn't mean a lower limit. We meant an upper limit. You can never give too much pe'ah, but you can't ever give. But you could actually give too little pe'ah because you have to give pe'ah. That's a commandment from God. Hakol lefi godel hasadeh. The way that we measure all this is according to the size of the field. As in, if you're going to give a 60th of a field that's this big, that's going to be different from if your field is like this big. It depends on how big your field is. So it's lefi godel hasadeh, according to the size of your field. Ulfi rov ha'aniyim, and according to the number of people who are in need. And so let's say that you live in a town and there's only one poor person, and you've got a gigantic field. You can't leave less than a 60th of that field to that poor person, even though there's only one of them. But you do also have to take into account that if you had 1,000 poor people and you had a very small field, then you might have to leave a lot more than 1/60th of your field. because it is a mitzvah upon all who have to give to those who don't have. And that is a very, very essential part of Judaism. That I have one cookie and you don't have any cookies, and we both want a cookie. So I'll understand, I'll give you a little piece of my cookie, and Raysh gets to eat a little bit of a cookie, and I get to have a bit of a cookie too. But let's say that Raysh also had a cookie, and I had a cookie. We don't necessarily need to swap cookies. I mean, if I want a little taste, maybe she'll give me a little taste, but that's different. So we measure lefi godel hasadeh, according to the size of the field. Lefi rov ha'aniyim, how many people are in need in your town, in your area. Ulfi rov ha'anava. Now this is an interesting piece. According to the size, according to the greatness maybe, of the anava. Anava, ha'anava, could mean the way that we're humility. The way that we're humble, as in, I'm very humble, and I don't need everything that I own. So I'm going to give more of what I have because I don't need it. But someone might say, well, I'm very humble and I don't want to show off what I own.
Right.
So I'm going to do a little bit less. And then, if you thought that was confusing enough, of whether being humble means you give less because you don't want to show off how much you really have, or it means you give more because you don't need it, there's a third explanation of what that word means. And this is where we wish we had the Talmud. But what they say, ha'anava, when you spell ha'anava, hey, ayin, nun, vav, hey, with a vav as the second to last letter, then we're talking about humility. And that's actually nice because it's actually very much related then to when we said rov ha'aniyim, that they have almost the same root words, root letters, ani and anav, very much related. But if you say the word anav and you're not spelling it, just like how in English, if I said I threw the basketball, that's different from when I say I walked through the hall.
Right. I mean, there's a lot of wordplay in rabbinic literature in general, so having homonyms like Jonah's describing isn't entirely uncommon, and it might even be a kind of saying that we're not aware of.
So ha'anava has two meanings. It could mean humility, and anav also means grape. We're talking here about we're talking about vineyards very often. So how many grapes do you have? How big's your field? Tell me how big your field is. Okay, it's 60 inches big. 60 square feet. So you can leave 1 square foot of your field. And how many poor people do you have? There's one poor person. So okay, let's say 1 square foot happens to be good enough. And how many grapes do you make? Do you make the grapes in that 1 square foot that you're leaving to the poor person? That's the trickery. That's the tricky part. You should always make sure that you're actually giving where you're actually making grapes. Don't just say, all right, I'll give 1/60th of the field because this is all the bad stuff. No, you have to give according to the good grapes. You give your good grapes. You don't just say that you give all the bad stuff to everybody else. You give what's good, and you also get to keep what's good. That's why the first thing that does not actually have a limit, back in our first Mishnah, hape'ah. The first thing is the corner. When it comes to the corner, if you ask someone to have a little corner of a bread that they're eating, how big is that corner? Are you having a crumb, or are or you're having like half of that bread. What's the corner? You can't give too much of a corner. The corner has to be a good corner, or else it's like you're not even giving. These are laws that make sure that we can give the way that we're supposed to give. And that's how the keren is kayemet in the olam haba. That is how the corner that we've given comes to be the corner that we get in the world to come.
And there's one other way to read this, which is also, we have this idea of supply and demand in the second text, right? Lifi rov ha'aniyim, according to the number of, to the degree of poverty that's in your society. And then when it says lifi rov ha'anava, it might also refer to communal standards for giving. In so much of rabbinic literature, the halacha is actually determined by what people are doing already. That what you and I do has an actual effect on the rest of the Jews. In other words, if there's a consensus, if many of us are doing something, then it actually holds as law in many cases. So I would be inclined actually to read this, it's not quite as inspiring perhaps, but to read it as according to communal standards of humility, in other words, of giving, and also the communal standards of how likely people are to take from the corners of your field. So it really talks about, again, going back to our theme of social relevance and social relationships, how essential our actions between each other are in creating this divine law. Because in each other we find divinity, and through each other we really create a divine world.
Amen. So, a few final thoughts, and I'd like to end with a bracha, because I think it's always important to begin study with a bracha, with a blessing, and to end with a blessing. And we started with that blessing already. We said a blessing over Torah study. But now we're going to wrap things up with a little bracha. Yehi ratzon milfanecha, may it be your will, Adonai Eloheinu, Lord our God, that we learn to give, and not to give too meagerly, but to give just enough, and to know that there's never too much giving, and to know that not only do we give blindly, but we give with the awareness that there are those who need to take, that there are those who need to receive, because if they don't receive, they cannot live. It is our responsibility, may we recognize that it is our responsibility to always give, and to always find ways, whether it be Torah, or whether it be reminding ourselves about our own familial needs, or whether it be reminding ourselves of how much peace there needs to be in the world. May we always know that it is our duty, that it is our mitzvah, that is our chiyuv, our obligation, to give, and to give, and to give. And in the world to come, what we will give, we will get to share. Hakeren kayemet lanu, olam haba. That corner for all the tzaddikim that we can be, for all of the righteous people whom we can be, will be waiting for us in heaven. May this come in good time. May the world to come in its own time, but may our righteousness come soon, bimhera v'yameinu, quickly, in our own days. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you very much for studying with us, and it looks now like we're probably doing these sessions every 2 weeks, so check back in 2 weeks, and we're looking forward to learning with you again really soon.
And we're still trying to figure out a way for us to do this as a spontaneous video, so we're still working on it, and this is our interim solution. Thank you for your patience, and we'll see you soon.
Laila Tov, good night.